Can games be art? It's a question that many have debated for years now, but no matter which side you might fall on, most would agree that two of the most influential games in support of this argument are the cult classics Ico and Shadow of the Colossus. These two masterpieces of design inspired artists and designers the world over, and their legacy persists to this day. With The Last Guardian finally complete then, I felt it was time to take a look back at the accomplishments and history surrounding these original games. Welcome to part 1 of our look back at the Ueda Collection, starting today with Ico. Looking back, it's difficult to overstate the importance and influence that these titles have had on the industry. One example of this can be seen in the Souls series, and the career of Hidetaka Miyazaki, who entered the gaming industry after being awoken to the possibilities of the medium, thanks in part to Ico. He is certainly not alone. Both games were born from the imagination of one Fumito Ueda, a designer who started out as an artist before entering the game industry as an animator. Like many other wonderful things in the industry, Ueda's career can be traced back to the late great Kenji Ino and his development studio, Warp. Ueda first worked on the Saturn exclusive survival horror title Enemy Zero. It was a challenging project, he has noted, but this was ultimately the springboard that would lead to something greater. Enemy Zero was completed and released at the end of 1996, and in 1997, Ueda left Warp to pursue an opportunity with Sony Computer Entertainment. In what would become somewhat of a tradition when working on the game's pre-production, Ueda and an assistant worked together in Lightwave to build an animated demonstration reel designed to convey his idea for a new game. Though crude today, this animation already gives insight into the direction Ueda intended to go. The basic idea, of course, was itself inspired by another game, Eric Chahi's Another World. After all, Ueda was known for using an Amiga computer when he was younger, which was not a common thing in Japan, and he was a fan of the cinematic, HUD-less presentation which Chahi somewhat pioneered in Another World. The slower-paced progression and puzzle solving fit perfectly with his idea of building a boy-meets-girl type of story in which the player is tasked with guiding an AI character through the game. During this time, Ueda was tasked with building a studio from nothing, and he did so by bringing in people he knew, of course, many of which had no background in game development at all. Starting in 1998 then, the team began to work on the game for Sony's original PlayStation console. While great strides were made and the team was producing great results from the system, the vision was ultimately limited by this aging hardware. Development continued for a while, but eventually the team reached an impasse. It might not be possible to complete the game as Ueda had intended without making dramatic changes. Thankfully, there was a solution on the horizon. Enter the PlayStation 2. Sony's next-generation console came at a perfect time and enabled the team to pursue its original vision without compromise. There is precious little footage of the game running in this pre-release state, but it is interesting to note that the game is running at a higher frame rate here, as you can see. Development pushed on though, and the game quietly made an appearance at E3 2000. There is precious little information out there on this iteration of the game, but with so many other titles being shown at this time, it ultimately garnered little attention at this point. But its showing 1 year later at E3 2001 is where people started to take notice, and this holds true for myself as well. I remember downloading a thumbnail-sized, QuickTime IGN video and marveling at what was on display. The lighting, animation, and look of the game seemed unlike anything else that had been produced at this point. I had to know more. And thankfully that didn't take too long. While Ico was scheduled for a release in the fall, during the summer months the PlayStation 2 Jam Pack disc was released to stores for $7.99. Which, yeah, you had to buy demos back then, but it did include a demo for Ico, which was my first experience with the game. Now this demo is a mishmash of different areas from the full game, and it played a little differently as a result, but the experience was certainly unforgettable. I too had been a fan of games such as Another World, although it was called Out of This World in the US, and immediately recognized that this is somewhat of a successor to that type of game. It was everything that Prince of Persia 3D was not. But while the gameplay was certainly a draw here, it was the visuals on display that impressed me the most. When I finally picked up the game in late September, the same release day as Silent Hill 2 by the way, the vision was finally laid before me. You have to remember that at the time of its release, aspects of the visuals presented in Ico were very new and different from other games on the market. The lighting stands out as one of those key features, with a focus on rich contrast and realistic hues. The team worked hard to simulate the look of intense, bright, blooming sunlight. When the camera catches a glimpse of the effect, the entire scene is bathed in an intense orange hue. Most scenes within the game were constructed within boxes, which the developer could then manipulate to determine what the player might see from inside this area. This could of course be applied to the bloom lighting, which was used throughout the game and quite new here, but also enabled things like the lightning effect in this area. Now of course the actual scene lighting was static, but we can at least see where real-time lights were placed for character lighting here. Each of the lines drawn in the scene and connecting to Ico represent a different hand-placed light source in the environment, and this helps determine the direction of the shadows. Speaking of which, Ico makes use of volume shadows, which enable characters to cast shadows on both the environment and themselves. These are then masked and filtered in order to give the impression of proper soft shadows. The models from these shadows are extruded from character geometry and are likely using fewer triangles than what you see while playing, as some of the details do appear to be lost. It does look quite good overall, and this footage should give you kind of a good idea of how this all works. Now, the game also makes use of then still new post-processing effects, including motion blur, which is applied to camera movement, depth of field, used in cutscenes and at different points in the game, and various other filters. You can use this debug mode then to adjust these effects manually, which kind of gives us a better idea of the level of control the developers could have in real time over each scene. Now all of these could be adjusted, and this includes things like motion blur, which could be modified or even disabled, as well as things like the various post-processing filters, which give the room different types of atmospheres you can see. The game also makes use of a nice fog effect, which can also be modified. You can adjust the RGB values of the fog itself, as well as the distance and thickness from the camera. Now all of these features were designed to allow the developers to customize and tweak each room independently to fit the intended atmosphere. Ico also makes great use of textures, while sidestepping some of the limitations of the PlayStation 2 here. Most of the environment consists of 256 by 256 pixel bitmaps, which were authored in such a way as to give the impression of depth or greater detail. The textures are stored as 8-bit palletized textures, of course, which also allows adjustments to be made to the colors, which again helps the developers modify the look of each room. Since this is a debug mode, we also get a peek at some of the tools and information the developers could use to understand the resources being used by the game. Always an interesting thing here. Unfortunately, this particular version with all of the debug options seems to only exist in demo form, and based on the levels which load from the menu, it was likely created for E3 demonstration purposes. It would be great to inject data from the finished game into this version. There does appear to be some work happening to restore this functionality over on Assembler Games, which is where the demo was posted in the first place, so there is some hope. Other impressive details include the water used in key areas. This small pool adjacent to the windmill warps and reacts to the player as you jump into it, and gives the impression of a full environmental reflection as well. I think this is probably one of the more famous scenes in the game. It was also modified between the full game and the demo. There's more of a puzzle here in the final title. Now Ico is also known for its trees. While there aren't many of them in the game, it was one of the first games to represent individual moving leaves in this fashion, while also simulating the appearance of light filtering through the branches. It's easy to look back on it today and see it as somewhat simplistic, but at the time, it was really ahead of the curve when most other games were still using just flat bitmaps to represent trees. This goes for the environment as well, which uses a lot of reasonably high poly count objects and features placed around. Ladders have nice curves to it, archways look very nice and smooth. It felt like a geometrically rich environment. And the animation, of course, is another high point here. All of the game's animation was created by hand rather than using motion capture data. It can look a little bit awkward at points, no doubt, but it ultimately works very well, and it gives the game sort of this hand-drawn look that I really quite like, and it definitely breathes extra life into the characters. Now, when you revisit the game today, there are some limitations that become evident. For instance, Eco runs in a low-resolution 512 by 224 mode at 30 frames per second. The reason I believe that this resolution was selected is actually chalked up to the desire for smoother image quality. Now, I know that sounds crazy, a lower resolution for better image quality, but you have to remember, at the time, many PS2 games being released were using field rendering or the interlaced mode, which could produce flicker and significant aliasing in many of the scenes. By using a lower resolution mode on a standard definition TV, Eco actually winds up looking cleaner than it would using a 448 flickery interlace mode. It's a low resolution but a progressive image, and that is detected by 240p by an upscaler unit. This, combined with the post-processing, results in a relatively soft and moderately clean looking game despite the low pixel count. But then I discovered something else interesting. That pre-release footage from before demonstrated Eco running at a higher frame rate, albeit with some slowdown. Now, it just so happens that the debug code available in this demo allows us to make an interesting change here. We can modify the frame step from 2 to 1. The result? Eco at 60 frames per second. That's right, it's possible to remove this limitation and change the way the game runs. It's certainly interesting to see the game transformed by this increased frame rate, because it does end up looking rather different than before, and the controls actually feel better as well. So although 30 FPS does work here, it is kind of neat to see the game at 60 FPS, so I was pretty excited. Of course, my initial excitement was dampened somewhat when the issues started to pop up. For one thing, when using this mode, the system will continue to draw all frames at all times, so when the game does slow down, the entire gameplay speed is sliced in half, rendering it virtually unplayable. It's not clear when they decided to go for the 30 frames per second target, but it's unlikely that in this state it would have actually been possible to hit a smooth 60 frames per second. It would definitely have required a lot of additional optimization. But it is neat to get an idea of what it might look like, and it would have been nice to see this type of option available in the HD remaster as well. But part of the reason why it might not be is tied to the other issue that cropped up, the cutscenes. All of these real-time sequences were created to run at 30 frames per second, and when you play them back in the 60 frames per second mode, the speed is doubled. It basically breaks the audio and everything looks like it's running in fast forward. Tying the animations to frame rate is definitely the kind of thing that you would see happen more often back then. But still, it's fascinating to consider what might have been, and it gives us a look into the development process here. Would you guys have wanted to see a 60 frames per second mode, or do you feel that they made the right choice by targeting 30 frames per second with more of a motion blur look going on instead? Hopefully this quick reflection back on some of the techniques and choices made with this game helps make it clear why Eco was and still is an impressive looking game. People have been discussing its contributions to gameplay, storytelling, and atmosphere for years, and those are all very valuable conversations, but I feel that the technology and implementation of the artwork also deserves a lot of credit. It's also worth noting that this is one game from the team which operates at a completely steady frame rate. It may only be 30 frames per second, of course, but it doesn't dip. The frame rate is very, very stable, from start to finish. The technology used in this game only benefits the experience and does not stand in the way of it, something that will become an issue in the next title from this team, unfortunately. But as beautiful as the game is on a standard PS2, the low resolution really isn't well suited to modern televisions. Enter the HD remaster of Ico, courtesy of the always reliable Bluepoint. In typical Bluepoint style, Ico HD is a masterclass in how to port an older game to a new platform. The look and feel of the artwork is retained 100%, but the low resolution veil has been lifted, replaced instead with a clean, crisp 1080p presentation. That's right, this is one of those games which actually supports full 1080p on the PlayStation 3, and it looks absolutely fantastic. Anti-aliasing has been added in the form of MLAA, which was pretty common on the PS3 at this time, while the post-processing techniques used on the PS2 have been refined with less noticeable ghosting visible across the scene. It's a cleaner looking game all around. Texture work also sees a tremendous boost in clarity here. In many cases, the original assets were used, simply repeated more often, giving the impression of higher detail without changing the artwork. It's an effective technique and looks great throughout the game. But there are some cases in which these textures didn't really hold up very well, and in that case, the team has crafted new textures which closely resemble the original artwork, designed to clean up those spots. There are some slight differences in the exposure of bright lights though, so the game does have a slightly different look, but I do feel it retains the overall atmosphere quite well. There really isn't a whole lot more to say about this particular version then. It's really just the way a remaster should be made, a faithful translation of a classic game that plays beautifully on modern displays. And it is a classic game that's still worth playing today. Sure, it has a few rough edges, but it's a game that still feels modern and it holds up well even now. Whether you opt for the original presentation on a PlayStation 2 or instead go for the HD remaster, it will be a great experience. Now of course you can also play Ico using an emulator such as PCSX2 of course, but I feel that the remaster is really a better option at this point. Emulation is still a decent way to go though if you own the original disc and no longer have access to a PS2 or would prefer to avoid the low resolution mode on that console. If you do plan to go the emulation route however, you'll want to enable the half pixel offset hack, which can be found here. This solves issues with the display of fog and other similar post effects throughout the game. Once enabled of course, the game looks rather accurate to the PS2 version with the occasional hitch or stutter occurring along the way. You can bump up the resolution and achieve the clarity or go beyond what's possible in the HD Collection version. But there are still small glitches along the way, and of course you're missing the higher quality assets from the HD version. So, of the various ways to play the game today then, while this might be the most convenient, it probably is my least favorite way to enjoy it. Of course, I'm always grateful to those working on emulation as it can help preserve these games for the future. But with that, we've come to the end of part 1 of our Ueda special. When we pick up next week then, we'll dive into Shadow of the Colossus, a game which pushes the limits of the PS2 platform with techniques that go beyond what you would expect from the hardware, at a cost of course. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.